So let's say this is a 20-unit apartment complex, and every single apartment rents for $1,200 a month. So here's my first question, folks. How much are you making a month?
$24,000.
Yep.
So you just told me 24,000. So let's do this. 20 units times 1,200 a month is 24,000. Now, if I asked you how much you're making a year, how much is that?
288,000.
So we took this and we multiplied it by 12 to get 288,000. Now let's talk about this for a second. The income capitalization approach, just like business financials, operates off of a year. You always look at the full year. So that's where we start, okay? Now, I want you to look at this number and I want you to tell me, are you actually not netting? Don't go there yet. Are you actually grossing this amount of money? If you own this 20-unit apartment complex.
If it's fully
Wait, hold on, Sandeep. What did you just say?
It's fully leased, yes.
There you go. If it's fully leased, if everybody pays on time, if everybody pays in general. Folks, we would have to live in a perfect world for this to be the case. Do we live in a perfect world?
No.
No. So we call this number that you just calculated the potential gross income, or PGI. There's where that P comes in. Potential gross income. As Sandeep said, you have the potential to gross this amount of money every year if every unit is rented and everybody pays. It's called potential gross income. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, let's say that we go on and I was to tell you that this has on average a 5% vacancy rate. Well, that gets us back to the scenario where we don't live in a perfect world. So if I give you the 5% vacancies, that vacancy rate is based on this potential gross income. So your potential gross income is 288,000. But we need to subtract out the vacancies and losses. That's what the V is, vacancies and losses. So if I tell you 5%, you would just take this 288 times your 5%. So you would subtract out your vacancies and losses of $14,400. Everybody still with me so far?
Yeah.
So when you take your potential gross income and you subtract out your vacancies and losses of 14,400, that gives you this new number, which is your E. This is your effective gross income, which you are realistically going to gross since we don't live in a perfect world. It's called your effective gross income, EGI. So the next piece of this is where we get into the actual word net, okay? You have operating expenses. Operating expenses are your taxes, your insurance, your property manager, your utilities, you know, everything that it costs to keep this place afloat. So that is this right here, O, operating expenses. So if I was to tell you, now this is, be careful here. If I was to tell you the operating expenses were $3,000 a month, what would you have to do with that information?
Times 12.
Multiply by 12 because we always deal with a year. So $3,000 a month in operating expenses times 12 would give us annual operating expenses of $36,000. So when you subtract out your operating expenses from your effective gross income, 273,600 minus 36,000, you are left with this magic number. That is your N right here. It is called your net operating income, or NOI. So folks, I want you to understand, based on the numbers that I just gave you, now this is, of course, I just made them up in my head so you can see this, how this works. What this means is you make $237,600 in passive income every year after expenses. So do you think if I was to sell this building, I'd be selling it for a lot or a little?
A lot.
A lot. And so understand the last piece of this is the capitalization part. In real estate, we will call something a cap rate. Folks, a cap rate, let's just say 8% for this example. Cap rate means the year-on-year return on your investment. So in other words, pretend this math isn't here for a second. If I told you that I bought a $2 million property at an 8% cap rate, you would take the 2 million times 8%, and that means that my net operating income is $160,000 a year. That's what a cap rate is. How much NOI you make based on your initial investment. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Cap rate is your year-on-year return on your investment. So if I said that I bought a $5 million property at a 6% cap rate, I am making 6% of $5 million in net operating income year over year. And so what you do with this NOI information, folks, an appraiser would look at other apartment complexes in the market, past sales, and they would determine what an average cap rate is for this type of investment. So they would basically take a couple of them and look at it and say, okay, well, the average cap rate for this type of investment is 8%. So if 8% is your return on your investment, in other words, your investment times 8% would give you your NOI. In order to find what this should or could sell for, it is your NOI divided by your cap rate. So in this example, it is an 8% cap rate. Take your NOI that I just gave you, 237,600, divided by 8%. Tell me what you get.
2,970,000.
So we've got 237,600 is our net operating income divided by, now folks, remember, you can let the calculator convert it for you, or you can do it yourself. You can do 8%. Oops, I did multiplies, I'm sorry. 237,600 divided by 8%, 2,970,000. So what is the value of this 20-unit apartment complex that makes an NOI of 237,600? It would sell for almost $3 million. So that is how we utilize this to determine the value based on the money it makes. The only thing that we would have to give you this information in a word problem, but the appraiser in the real world, the appraiser would look at past apartment complex sales to determine an average cap rate. So the appraiser would determine that and then use that information once they found the NOI to determine what it should probably sell for. Now, folks, when you sell a business, you got to open your books. You got to tell people what you make. They don't have to take your word on it. I'll give you an example of this. Elon Musk, when he bought Twitter and then stupidly called it X, like an idiot. Like, what's this man's obsession with the letter X? Anyway, there was that whole big fuss where he was like, well, maybe I'm not going to buy it, because he thought that they fudged the numbers and like lied about how many users there were, and there was a lot of bots. And so that's kind of the thing. When you are dealing with a business, they have to show you how much money they make. If you ever hear about the big CEOs going to jail, it's because they falsified documents to make it look better and then tried to sell it. So please vacuum every office nightly. Your potential gross income, what you could make in a perfect world with fairy dust and unicorns, minus your vacancies and losses, gives you your effective gross income. Effective gross income minus your operating expenses gives you your NOI. And NOI divided by your cap rate gives you the value of a piece of income producing property under the income capitalization approach, also called the direct capitalization approach. Now, I will add one more financing piece into the mix here. There is one thing that is a big thing that is not accounted for in your net operating income, and that is your debt service. Folks, what is debt service?
Principal and interest.
Principal and interest. It is not considered part of your operating expenses. And I'll tell you why. If Elon Musk, let's use him as the example since we just did, was to come by this building for $2.9 million in cash, Elon Musk has no debt service. If I was to buy that building with a 1% down payment, I got a heck of a big monthly payment. The point is, the debt service is not considered in this because that is not a universal metric. It depends on how much money you put down. It depends on your credit. It depends on anything, everything. But this is a universal metric. If I own this property and it continues to operate as it is, I will have a net operating income of 237.6. If Sandeep buys it, same thing. If Sam buys it, same thing. If Justin buys it, same thing. So that's why we use these universal metrics. So debt service would come out after. So if you subtract your principal and interest, which is your debt service, what you are left with is what we call your before tax cash flow. So if you take your NOI and subtract out your debt service, which is your principal and interest payment each year, you are left with your before tax cash flow. Now, your before tax cash flow and debt service is not a part of the income capitalization approach, but this is just a supplemental financing thing that you just need to be aware of from a general point of view. You could see the terms cash flow and debt service on the test for sure. So just like anything else, all the math can be easily manipulated into a, let me fix this real quick so you can kind of see it. Mm-hmm. Kind of got shifted on the slides. So I just wanted to, yeah. All these things can easily be manipulated into a T-bar. And so value times your cap rate would give you your NOI. So conversely, remember when you're coming down the T-bar, you're dividing. So NOI divided by your cap rate equals the value. That's all we just did there. And as I mentioned earlier, the cap rate, just your year-on-year return on your investment. That's all that means. If you buy a property at, 500,000 with a 12% cap rate, you would get a 12% return. If you buy it at a 6% cap rate, you get a 6% return. So it is a correlation of what it's worth or what you purchase it at and what you get back. And the other thing I told you is that what is not considered in here is debt service. Now, I will warn you, I don't know that they're going to be this mean, but folks, they may use this terminology and you may not have to do every bracket. So they may just say something like your effective gross income is this. Well, that means they've already knocked out the PGI and the vacancies and losses because they've done that math for you. So if you've got your effective gross income and your operating expenses, you can just subtract that operating expenses from the EGI to get your NOI. So here's an example for you in a little prettier fashion. 12-unit apartment community generates 100,000 per year in rental income. The owner spends 55,000 per year on management, taxes, insurance, and maintenance. The NOI of the property is, now this is where I was telling you, some steps have knocked out. So what is the NOI on this one?
$1,145,000.
Not the value. the NO or the NOI. What is your net operating income?
45,000.
Just 45,000. Because what they've basically done is they've taken out the vacancies and losses, and so this is your EGI. That's your operating expenses. So EGI minus operating expenses gives you your NOI. And I told you the way that they come up with a cap rate, it's just a correlation between the sales price of a past sale and the cap rate it was purchased at based on its NOI. I'm sorry, or the NOI that it was purchased and making. So if you look what an appraiser would look for, okay, well, here's another apartment complex. This one had an NOI of 42,000 and it sold for 489. So it was purchased at an 8.6% cap rate. This one had an NOI of 49,000 and a sales price of 511. So you just divide the NOI by the sales price to get your cap rate. That's all that's happening here. So that's how an appraiser determines the cap rate for the market. I'm trying to put this where you can see it. Let me see if I can make it smaller. What you got, Dora?
From the prior example, how did you get that to be the effective gross income, the 100,000?
It was given to you in
It
the
was
property.
given to you. That was just an example. So on a test question, it told you that
No. Okay, for like if I'm reading this, right, it says generates 100,000 per year in rental income. How does that drive me to think that's the effective gross income?
because you can't worry about things that aren't in the question. If they don't give you vacancies and losses, if they don't give you, all of those different things, then they
I'm gonna
can't
assume
expect you to
that.
know that. That's the only number you have as income. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, effective gross income is an actual mathematical function we can utilize. Potential gross income is a starting point if they give us vacancies and losses to get us back to reality. Oh, there goes gravity. I'm just kidding. So
Okay.
it will never be this vague on a test question. I was just proving a point that sometimes the steps are already done for you. So it may say something like your EGI is this, your operating expenses are this, and all you have to do is take the EGI and subtract out the operating expenses to get your NOI.
But if it doesn't say, just like this, I'm going to assume that, okay, that there's income and expense. Okay.
Yeah, every question is possible to be answered. It wouldn't be fair for them to say something like this and them expect you to figure out what your vacancies and losses were. That would be impossible from this question. So you can only work with what you got. Yeah. Da, 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 da. Do the math for me on this one. If you had an NOI on a given property for $45,000 and the cap rate for that type of investment was 9.23%, what should be the value of this property? You can put it in the chat if you got it.
Do we still round up?
I mean, for the sake of this, you can just give me a dollar amount. But okay.
That's what I got too, but I don't feel like that makes sense.
Folks, all you're doing is taking your NOI and dividing by your cap rate. But remember, you can't leave it as 9.23. That's a percentage. It's 0.0923. Got to convert it. NOI divided by 9.23%, which is 0.0923.
I'm gonna be honest. I did not know that that's how that worked. That you had to do 0 point. I thought you in this situation since it. I'm not good at math. You
No,
can
remember
ignore
the
that.
percentages. You can't do anything with percentages like that. That's just a representation for us to understand mathematically speaking. To actually enter that into a calculator, I remember on day one I told you when you see the percent sign, think cents. What would 9 and very small amounts 2 3 cents look like? 9 cents is 0.09. So you got to think of a percent as a cents. 0.0923. Or in other words, move the decimal over 2 times to convert it. So basically what you're doing is 45,000 divided by 0.0923. You cannot just put 9.23. That's not how percentages work.
But if you do put 9.23,
You hit
hit
the
the
percent
percent
button.
sign.
Yeah, there you go. So that's where I've been telling you, you can do either or, convert it yourself or let the calculator convert it for you. But just understand that putting 9.23 just by itself, not going to do it. So there you go. Now that we've got the decimals right, the answer is in fact 487,541. Now this is where you can use some common sense too, folks. If you're doing a math question like this and you don't remember to convert the percentage sign, would a building that makes you $45,000 a year in passive income be sold for $4,800?
I wouldn't buy it.
I would buy it for
would.
$4,800.
I'd buy the hell out of that thing if I had the money.
No, so what we're saying is it's worth 487,000, but because people didn't convert the decimals, they only got a value of 4,800. If it
You
was,
wouldn't want to buy it.
I would.
No, not if they're telling you you're not making no money off of it.
No, you're misunderstanding. If it makes $45,000 and they put in the decimal wrong, and so they're coming up with it, it's only worth 4,800. I would buy it for 4,800
Yeah.
to make 45,000 a year. Yeah, there you go. So that's what I'm telling you. You got to catch these mistakes. You know, it's pretty obvious that you would not be buying this building for only $4,000 if it's making you passive income each year of 45,000. So here is, kind of a more detailed income capitalization approach that kind of goes hand in hand with an operating budget with from a property management point of view. Folks, understand that a property manager is not judged based on, well, in a nutshell, they're judged based on their NOI. Not any gross or anything. The better your NOI is as a property manager, the better you are at managing that property. It's all about what you make, not necessarily what you gross, just like any business. It's one thing to say you have $6 million in sales, but if you have $6 million in expenses, you're a worthless business. So NOI is the epitome of how we judge a property manager to see if they're any good. Now, there's one more kind of discussion in this, and then we're going to move on into bigger and better things. And that is the gross rent multiplier. It is a similar concept, but in a much more simplistic fashion. Instead of it being a correlation between, all these metrics and NOI and what it sells for or cap rates, a gross rent multiplier is utilized to determine what a property should make or should be worth based on very simplistic factors of income. And that's rent. So let me explain. If a property sold for $300,000 and it was an investment property, so it was sold with a tenant still in place, and they were charging $1,800 a month in rent. All a gross rent multiplier is taking a property like this, sold for $300,000, and dividing it by what it was renting for when it sold to give you a gross rent multiplier of 166.67. Now, what you would do if you were trying to value a property using the gross rent multiplier, you would look at multiple past sales and figure out 3 or 4 gross rent multipliers for similar properties. So let's say that you get 166.67, 172.50, 171, and 163. All you would do is you would take these multiple gross rent multipliers, average them out to find an average gross rent multiplier in your area. You don't really need to know or do all this, but let me just explain this. So let's say, and this is not right, but let's say that your average is 167. Okay. That is an average gross rent multiplier for your market. Here's how you use it. If you were trying to sell an investment property that had a tenant in place and they were paying $2,400 a month, instead of valuing it based on how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, and all that stuff, you are valuing it based on what somebody might be willing to pay for it for the money it makes. So you take your average gross rent multiplier, as the name implies, gross rent multiplier, you multiply it by the amount of rent that you're charging. 167 times 2,400. You could probably sell this property for $400,800. That's all it's doing. It's using a correlation of past investment properties sold, and the only metric it's considering is the correlation between what it rented for, what it sold for. Same methodology as the income cap approach, but it doesn't have the adequate reporting. It's just one factor of income, the rent. Now, if you ever see the term gross income multiplier, don't let it confuse you. It is just looking at this from an annual basis. So in that first example, I used this and I calculated this gross rent multiplier right here. A gross income multiplier in a lot of instances is just looking at it from a year. So in other words, 1,800 times 12 gives you gross income each year of 21,600. And so then you would just look at the correlation that way. $300,000 sales price divided by 21,600. That is your gross income multiplier, 13.8 versus the rent multiplier of 166. It's just apples to oranges. One's looking at a year's worth of income, one's looking at a month, and it's just a different correlation. That's all it says. So if you're looking sales price divided by, like I said, the annual would be the gross income multiplier. The monthly is the gross rent multiplier. You could see either, but sales price divided by either the gross income or gross rent, or what it made would give you the gross rent multiplier or the gross income multiplier. Nothing too crazy there. And so here's an example of a question, but this is using the gross income multiplier. Just be careful. If it's talking about monthly, use monthly. If it's talking about annual, use annual. Sometimes they'll call it things weird, but you could see either the annual or the monthly. So this is $7,800 a year. And so the gross rent multiplier, you would have to do some mathing out. But folks, this is not a crazy level in any way, shape, and form, but it would just be 7,800 times 15. That's all there is to it. Don't overcomplicate this.
117,000.
There you go. Bam. So, last couple notes in the valuation section. Of course, there's just a lot to it. My biggest recommendation, as with anything on the test, folks, you've got to just make sure that when you are faced with a test, when you're faced with questions, you read the questions very carefully. And you make sure you pay attention. Don't jump into an answer. Don't jump into, just, oh, it's got to be this. Really think about it. Because believe it or not, as abstract as some of these concepts are, sometimes it's just so simple as getting the right word in your head. If you read it as, offer versus a contract, it's going to change it. If you read it as a residential sale versus a, rental property, it's going to change things. You just got to be careful on any of these questions. I've already talked about this. Real estate appraisers use that methodology called reconciliation where they give weighted averages. So if you look at an appraisal report, and there's copies of them in your textbook, there is typically a secondary approach even for residential. So they use the sales comparison approach. They'll have the comps, but then they will have another thing that'll say, well, value as determined by cost approach. So reconciliation, when applicable, would use all three valuation methods and use a weighted average for what is the best methodology. Of course, for resale residential, sales comparison approach gets the most weight, cost gets a little bit of weight, and then income capitalization approach and gross rent multipliers don't typically get considered because most properties aren't investment properties being sold. So we just talked about it. How would we calculate your net operating income? Net operating income. How do we find that?
Gross income minus the expenses.
Effective gross income minus operating expenses. That's exactly right. Now, whether you like T-bars or not, I mean, I'll just help you out with this one, folks. Remember, your T-bar is the whole times the rate equals the part. And so value, cap rate, NOI, that would be your T-bar expense. Value, cap rate. Yet again, this one's kind of moved over. I got to fix that. How about this question for you? If the comparable property feature is superior to the subject property, we would adjust the comparable property price which way?
Down.
Down. Superior, you are subtracting value, okay? If the comparable is superior, you subtract value. So it goes down. If it's inferior, add. There you go. Boop, 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 boop. CMA is comparative market analysis. BPO is broker price opinion. Of course, there are plenty of forces that influence value: political, social, economic. GRM, gross rent multiplier, cost approach. Of course, that is one method of the real property valuations, typically used for insurance purposes and non-income producing properties that are unique. Schools, hospitals, churches, things of that nature have a lot of different methodologies of depreciation, reproduction costs versus replacement costs, things that are curable and incurable. Income capitalization approach, also called the direct cap approach, and then the sales comparison approach, most commonly utilized for residential real estate. Same method we use as appraisers use, but we can't call ours an appraisal and they can. Which leads us to the next fun-filled thing. Boop. Insurance. Now, folks, let me just give you the nitty-gritty on insurance, okay? Let's just put it all out there because I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Insurance is not crazy testable. I'm going to point out the things that you need to know, and then we're going to move on to other things that are more testable, more important. There are three types of insurance that you have been taught in this course. It is very important that you can differentiate between them. Homeowners insurance protects the dwelling. Title insurance protects your concept of ownership. And private mortgage insurance or just mortgage insurance protects the lender in case you default because you put less than 20% down. All different types of insurance. All work very differently. So we are talking about hazard insurance, also called property insurance on this one. Okay. The things you need to know are some very matter-of-fact things. And of course, sometimes you'll see some crazy questions get in the mix, but we're going to talk about them very briefly. So when we're dealing with standard full coverage homeowners insurance, understand that they cover a lot of different things. fire, lightning, windstorm, hail, glass breakage, explosion, riot, civil commotion, damage by vehicle, aircraft, smoke, vandalism, malicious mischief, theft, loss of property removed from the premise when it is endangered by fire or other perils. So it covers all of these different things. Basically, when you have full coverage, it covers a bunch of things, and then it would name certain things it doesn't cover. There is a lower tier policy that would only cover very specific named perils. That is an HO2, which is not sufficient for most lenders. What we are talking about, the standard homeowners insurance policy, is called an HO3 policy. Now, please be aware that floods are never covered in a standard homeowners insurance policy. And when I say flood or flood insurance, I mean the rivers are rising or the ocean is coming in. If your bathroom starts flooding, that's covered. Okay, flooding, pipelines bursting, that's covered. But waters from bodies of water, that is never automatically covered. You would need a supplemental flood insurance policy, or what we call a rider that gets attached to it. Now, you do need to know, sometimes you could see these crazy things that you may not consider. Civil riot, commotion, vandalism, mischief, aircraft, war, all these things are covered under your standard homeowners insurance policies. Which is kind of weird, but they are. The other things that you need to know are, of course, the differentiation between the three most common policies. The standard homeowners insurance policy, I told you, is an HO3. You need to know that. HO3 is typically the minimum coverage requirement that satisfies the needs of the lender. Now, I will remind you, we talked about this a little bit early on. Folks, are you required to have homeowners insurance?
Not if you're, if you're buying it cash or not.
There you go.
Only-
If you have a loan, yes. If you own it outright, no. Keep that in mind in case they try to trick you on the test. So HO3 is the most common minimum full coverage policy that is expected by a lender. HO4 is a renter's policy that covers personal property only. And an HO6 is for condominium ownership. It is walls in and exclusive fixture usage. So it is a step above a renter's policy. You do need to know all three of those. Now, a couple other terms that you could see in the insurance conversation. Let's talk about what a clue report is. Folks, if you didn't know this, just like you have a credit report that judges your spending and how you pay, you have a report on you for insurance. They know when you rear end a bunch of people. They know when you get a bunch of speeding tickets. They know, and so they can change your rates. The report you have on you is called a clue report. It's called Comprehensive Loss and Underwriting Exchange. So they can basically pull a report on you just like a credit report. Now, as such, you are always entitled to know what people know about you. And so you can actually go and get a copy of your clue report if you wanted to see what was on it. Sure you can. Just like you can go get a credit report to see what is on that. And your property, real property, also has a clue report. So with a homeowner, or should I say, let's just use a car as an example. If you have car insurance and you get in a lot of accidents, they may drop you or make coverage unaffordable. Same thing is true of a home. A home has a clue report too. So if 123 Main Street has like 17 claims, they may drop that home and they may consider it uninsurable because it's too high of a risk. So it's a clue report. There's clue reports on real property and on people. Comprehensive Loss and Underwriting Exchange. Now, one of the biggest, most testable things in regard to insurance for the North Carolina State Licensing Exam, hands down, is how they are going to test you on insurance coverage for closing a real estate transaction. It is the seller's home up to and including the day of closing. They would not want to terminate it even on the day of closing. It wants to go through and after the day of closing and then be terminated after all is good and well. The other thing that comes into play is, of course, as I told you, in those sales contracts, we could negotiate a buyer moving in before closing, which means that buyer needs a renter's policy and the seller needs to make sure they're good to have tenants. The seller could stay in after closing, which means the seller becomes a tenant. And then now they need to get a renter's policy because their homeowner's policy will be considered null and void soon. And the new buyers would need to make sure they have coverage. That is one of the most testable things, hands down. So flood insurance, as I said, is a separate policy. It is not automatically in there. Yet again, if you have a loan, if any part of your property is located in a federally designated floodplain, your lender is probably going to require you to have flood insurance. Now, of course, one of the other things that comes into play here is the NFIP, and we were talking about that earlier. The National Flood Insurance Program is basically where all insurances help subsidize the flood policies because they are so expensive. And of course, there's all kinds of crazy things going in there. And so the National Flood Insurance Act, creating the NFIP and FEMA, subsidize the flood insurance to help pay for it and make it more affordable, although who knows for how much longer. And the reason is we are all too stupid to stop living where there's pretty water. We like it. It's too pretty. So of course we keep living on the beaches, the rivers, the lakes, the streams, and we just deal with the floods. We just rebuild and rebuild and rebuild. There are maps that are available, and FEMA is the one that the banks will rely on. There are local flood maps as well that pull from FEMA, but they're not as up to date. So you would want to make sure that you look at the FEMA floodplain. Lived in Texas during Hurricane Harvey. I can tell you all about this. That's not a good thing to be able to tell people about, Kirsten. That is not fun for anybody. It is a hot mess express, isn't it? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we lost our entire house.
Like the house floated away or like it was total?
Our house was 10 feet underwater.
You're kidding.
Yeah, it was totally insane. I
Get
got
on
this.
the air mattress. Just grab the broom. We just paddle away.
We literally had to float out on an air mattress.
Wow.
I'm not even joking when I tell you, like, we were the people you see on TV that you're like, I can't believe this is real life. That was us. It was us.
At least Nick's pretty tall, right? He's just like,
Yeah. I won't take up time, but it's a story for another.
I'll have to ask him. That's crazy. I was just joking about the air mattress, and you're like, no facts. We actually did that. That did happen. That's crazy. No, no. So flood insurance is a separate policy. You would need to get it added on. Folks, you can have flood insurance even if you are not in a floodplain and it is more affordable. Sometimes it is advantageous if you are even remotely close to a body of water, because with Hurricane Matthew and stuff that we had, a lot of properties were adversely affected that we had never had issues with before because we had a couple big storms back to back. What you got, Jacob?
So what if, I know that you said that normal home insurance covers if, like, say, a pipe breaks or something like that and your bathroom floods your house, whatever. What if it's, right, okay, so like back when I lived in Utah, this was pretty common. It would happen to people all the time because there they actually build basements. And so sometimes when it would rain, if somebody didn't have a good seal on their window well or something like that, it would flood like a basement bedroom of their house or something like that. Is that something that you have to get extra insurance for, or is that something
Typically,
that's
yes.
usually covered?
Typically, yes. No. Yeah, always a good idea to have these discussions with your insurance policy because you don't want to find out too little too late that you don't have coverage for those things, right?
Well, I'm not asking for personal use.
No,
I'm
no, I
asking
know.
for
Yeah, no, you were
text.
just asking for educational. Yeah. But yeah, it's a lot of times, yeah, they get a little crazy there. So of course, understand that floodplains are a material fact. You would have to disclose that a property was in a floodplain or if it had flooded previously or anything of that nature. You can always tell when you know you're in a floodplain, you drive around and everybody's AC unit is on stilts. That's always a good indication that you're in a floodplain because they're like, nope, AC unit goes up here. Just it's a little bit higher. And then one other thing to be aware of, folks, if you've ever heard the term 100-year floodplain, a lot of people have this misconception like, oh, it only floods once every 100 years. No. 100-year floodplain means you have a 1% chance of it flooding every single year. Does not mean there's no way they don't have like a crystal ball like, oh, when will it flood again? 100 years, great. They don't have that. So a 100-year floodplain refers to a 1% likelihood of it flooding every single year. Now, there are some other crazy things throughout the text on insurance, like, co-insurance and coverage and that. But insurance is not, a crazy testable subject. So, I mean, you take the quizzes in the program, you're going to be okay. All right. You'll be fine. Which leads us to landlord tenant. Now, folks, I'm going to kind of couple the landlord tenant and property management chapters together, even though they're back to back. Let me explain something. Okay. There is a lot of stuff with the land management sections that I would argue is very self-explanatory. If you just sit there and you kind of read through it and you think about the relationships, you can sometimes figure this out. And this goes back to what I told you earlier in the class. You've always got to think about who the parties are. So if I said a property manager, the parties to that relationship are the property owner and the broker acting as the property manager, which makes the tenant a customer to the broker. Now, in this one, we're just talking about the property owner and the tenant, not a broker property manager yet. But as I said, sometimes you can just navigate these with a little bit of common sense. The hardest part, though, is the legislation that exists. And so that's what we're going to focus on. Not the crazy things that, are common sense, but the legislation. There are a lot of tenant protection laws. Now, this is where states are very different. There is blanketed federal protections for tenants in some regard for residential. There are next to no protections for commercial tenants. And then in North Carolina, we have way more than, some states, to say the least, but there is a lot of protections across the board. So we're going to talk about those, kind of factors within this. Now, this is also where, here's a flashback for you. I will remind you about the leasehold estates. I know a lot of you didn't like that section when we talked about the freehold estates versus the leasehold estates. And we just did a quick mission on the leasehold estates, also called non-freehold estates. So we're going to bring those back again and just make sure that you remember what they are and how to interpret them on the test. We're also going to talk about different types of leases, both commercial and residential leases that could exist, which is yet again a verbiage type of thing, flashcard level stuff. Yet again, nothing in this section is crazy testable, or at least not crazy hard. I promise. Yes, you're going to see it. You're going to see it all. But this is not typically where people are screwing up the most. So half the battle is just understanding the words here. Landlord is the person who owns the property, or in other words, the lessor. And then you've got the tenant, who is also referred to as the lessee. You got the ors and the e's. Remember, or is always a give or e is a receivee. So the landlord gave the tenant the lease, lessor, who received the lease, lessee. And what is happening, if you remember those earlier conversations with a bundle of legal rights, they have, albeit temporarily, granted you the right of possession, the right of exclusion, and the right of enjoyment. And they will eventually get those back. That's what's happening there. They've severed those rights and given them to you, the tenant. Now, that being said, I've been talking a lot. So, of course, I'll go ahead and round up and give you a couple minutes. Go ahead and take a break. Come back at 7:25, and we'll hit the ground running again. Whoop, whoop. So, landlord tenant, as I said, landlord is the property owner, tenant is the person renting it. And so this is where they have typically been granted this right of possession, right of enjoyment, and right of exclusion from those bundle of legal rights that the owner is said to have. Now, if you ever see the terminology privity of estates and privity of contracts, privity of estates is mutual or successive relation to the same right and property. As you can realize that the owner of the property has some type of estate in the property, as does the tenant. That is what we call privity of estates. They both have an estate simultaneously, albeit slightly different, because the owner is still the owner, but this person has been granted, as I said, this right of possession, this right of control. This is what we call a leasehold estate. So this simultaneous freehold estate and leasehold estate is what we call privity of estates, mutual interest in the same property simultaneously. Privity of contracts is basically where we would outline how the contract can be flowed. Leases may not be assigned or transferred without all parties' permission. That's very commonly how it goes. Most contracts require permission of the parties to assign, to transfer, to sublease, or anything like that. And so that is outlined within the relationships. Of course, a lease, which is a type of contract, could have something in there that states that you could assign it without permission, but most do not. It would have to be something that was specifically agreed upon. So here's where we kind of transition and get into the some of the laws, expectations, and rules with the relationship between landlord and tenant. And there are, as I said, national ones, and then some of them are kind of mirrored on the North Carolina level, and then some of them go even further and greater on the North Carolina level. So when we deal with residential rental agreements, emphasis on the residential, I told you there is next to no protections for a commercial tenant. Nobody cares about them. The idea is if they're doing business, they can do business or not. You know, I mean, not a whole lot of protections for the commercial. But for residential, there is, of course, these protections because people should have a safe and acceptable place to live kind of conversation. So this big piece says, obligations of landlord and tenant are mutually dependent. There are things that the landlord has to provide to the tenant. There are things that the tenant has to provide to the landlord. In a nutshell, the landlord has to provide a safe, habitable living environment. And the tenant has to not waste the property, has to protect the property, and has to pay rent. So this is where, in a deeper rooted extent, there is a blanketed kind of law for this nationally speaking. But in North Carolina, we very specifically have what's called the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreements Act. I'm going to say it again. The North Carolina Residential Rental Agreements Act. And so what is within those is those deep-rooted obligations. And so the landlord, the owner, has to provide a fit and habitable living environment. What does that mean? It means they have to provide potable water. They have to provide heat. AC, believe it or not, is not required. So they have to provide heat. They have to provide doors and locks on windows, at least on the first floor. They have to provide smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors with working batteries at the start of tenancy. Now, this is testable. The tenants are responsible for the battery changes, okay? So they have to provide working smoke and carbon monoxide detectors with new batteries at the beginning of tenancy, but the tenant is actually responsible for the replacement of those batteries. Now, I will go on to amend that statement and state the carbon monoxide detector is technically only required on any floor where there is a combustible heat source or a garage. They're not required outright. When I say combustible heat source, I mean like a gas heat pump. So, safe, habitable living environment. Please understand that the way that they state this is that the waiver of the rights of the parties is not allowable. It's not legal. A buyer cannot be like, no, I don't need heat. And the landlord cannot say, I'm not giving you heat. So you cannot waive your rights underneath this. They always have to provide a safe, habitable living environment. Now, of course, that's from a legal point of view, folks. Do you think people waive their rights to this all the time? Yes. Is it legal? No. So think the waiver of the rights is unlawful. You cannot waive your rights to a habitable living environment. You cannot waive the rights to provide one. That's just part of it. So this next piece leads into some of the very important things. Okay, so it says must remediate eminently dangerous items in a reasonable period of time. Of course, anything that they're required to provide to you, if it stops being true, they would have to remedy it in a reasonable period of time. And if they don't, there are repercussions for both the landlord for not adhering to this and the tenant for not adhering to this. Now, here's the visual that goes hand in hand with some of those items, okay? Working lockable windows and doors on ground level, at least the first floor. Potable water is required. So what we're saying is lack of potable water means water that you can use to bathe in, drink, and or otherwise would be an issue. Has to have a heat source. Now, do be aware that AC is not required, but this does require them to maintain what you had at initial occupancy. So if you took possession and you did have AC and the AC were to fail, they are not allowed to just say, oh, I'm not going to fix your AC for you. A couple other things that came into the mix, and this is where I'll kind of go off on a tangent with another concept that this ties into, okay? I told you that you have to have these smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, at least a carbon monoxide detector when there is a combustion heat source or, a garage. The tenant's responsible for the batteries. But then it says lack of a working toilet. Well, folks, yeah, lack of a working toilet, it would be a problem. But let me use this to introduce your remedy if you are in a situation where the landlord does not provide these items, okay? Let's say that something that was required stops working. You would have to provide written notice of that and inform the landlord of your desire to have them repair it. And hopefully they respond in a reasonable period of time. If they do not respond in a reasonable period of time, a tenant has a legal right to perform what is called a constructive eviction. It's very important. There are a couple different terminologies that are easy to get mixed up. The legal thing that a tenant is entitled to when a landlord fails in the Residential Rental Agreements Act of North Carolina is a constructive eviction. So this question down at the bottom says, can a tenant stop paying rent if these criteria are not met? No. You are not allowed to stop paying rent. You are not allowed to have the repairs done yourself and deduct it from rent. None of that is lawful. But what you can do is provide the seller with written notice of their failure to maintain it and inform them of your intent to vacate the premises and terminate your lease early if they do not remedy it in a reasonable period of time. So this is where I wanted to use the toilet as an example. Folks, if you are renting a house that has 6 toilets and one is not working, you probably do not have the right to do a constructive eviction. You've got plenty of other toilets. But if it's the dead of winter and the heat has been broken for 3 weeks, you probably are well within your right to perform a constructive eviction. So a constructive eviction is a lawful way for a tenant to legally terminate a lease early. They provide notice of what's wrong, request the landlord to fix it. If they fail to fix it, they will give additional notice of their intent to vacate for their failure to fix it. And if they still don't fix it, you can leave. And you have terminated your lease early. And it's lawful. But you cannot stop paying the rent until you leave. It's called a constructive eviction. Now, this bottom note is what you got to be very careful of. Do not confuse a constructive eviction with what is called a self-help eviction. A self-help eviction is when the landlord wants you out, and so they start doing things like shutting off the utilities, removing your personal property, changing the locks on the doors. Self-help evictions are illegal in North Carolina. A constructive eviction is very legal if done the right way. For a tenant to perform because of a landlord's failure to comply with the Residential Rental Agreements Act. Now, of course, sometimes these are complex, and so it's not a good idea to just do them. It may be advisable to get advice from an attorney before you want to perform a constructive eviction to make sure that you do it the right way and there's no recourse and nothing can come back on you. So when we're dealing with a landlord who fails in their duties under the Residential Rental Agreements Act, this is a tenant's recourse, a constructive eviction. Now we switch gears and we say, okay, well, what is a landlord's remedy for a tenant's failure to abide by the Residential Rental Agreements Act? Well, it is called a summary ejectment. That is how a landlord would evict a tenant. They go in front of a magistrate, have a hearing. It can sometimes take a while. They present all the evidence as to why they're evicting them. And after it's been granted, they will issue what's called a writ of possession. The writ of possession is where the sheriff says, get the hell out. Take possession back of the property. That is after the summary ejectment has gone through the entire process. Now, do be aware that a property manager could handle the summary ejectment on behalf of the property owner, the landlord. But the restrictions are they have to be the one that collects the monies if they're going to be the ones handling the summary ejectment.
Is that just like an eviction notice?
No. Notice is that you are going to go down. You have to provide the notice before you can go down and actually file the summary ejectment. And so the notice is this is about to happen. And after they met the certain criteria for the time frame of notice, then you go down to the magistrate and ask for them to be removed from the property by way of the summary ejectment. They will ask for all the details. There are statutory periods it has to go through. There is notice that is sent. And then after it's been granted, you will get that writ of possession where the sheriff will go and remove them from the property. Now, yet again, don't confuse this other thing on here. This retaliatory eviction. A retaliatory eviction is basically where you do something that pisses off the landlord, like ask for too many repairs or report them for failure to comply with something. And so they start doing things to try to evict you, like raising the rent to astronomically high rates, or, trying to kick you out with undue calls or things of that nature. And of course, there are penalties for trying to do that. There is up to a year's worth of protection if you can prove that that is why they're trying to kick you out, if it's in retaliation.
Is that just in North Carolina or is that everywhere?
I'm not going to say it's just in North Carolina, but some states don't do it the same way as we do it. So there's probably other states that do it the same way, but I can't say like every state does it the exact same.
Yeah, because I'm like thinking New York, where they have like the ability to raise your rent to an astronomical amount because they know that they can get it. So I was curious if when we're tested on this, we will only, North Carolina. I'm stupid.
No. That was that was a good question, because I told you some of these things are blanket, and then there are national rental agreements that you would look at where they have to be fair to each other and just. But this is very specifically North Carolina. But some other states do fall into this, so you could absolutely see very similar verbiage, not exact, but similar verbiage on the national portion. Yeah. Now, I told you that there are duties between the landlord and the tenant. And so if the tenant does not follow their obligations, that's where this summary ejectment comes into play. That is a standard eviction proceeding. Well, what are their duties? As I told you, the landlord has to keep it a fit and habitable living environment. The tenant has to maintain the dwelling. They have to make sure that they keep it free from trash and debris and the plumbing fixtures clean. And of course, they have to pay their rent. If they don't, we got an issue, and that is why we can go after them by way of that summary ejectment. So let me ask you a question to make sure you're with me on this. True or false, a tenant has given their landlord notice in writing that the city has declared their tap water unfit for drinking. After several weeks, the landlord has not taken any action to correct the issue. The tenant can terminate the lease via a self-help eviction.
False.
False.
Caught it.
False. Why? What can they actually do?
A constructive eviction.
A constructive eviction. Some of y'all have kind of gotten the trend on these just to make sure that y'all always read the daggum question, right? Because words matter. Self-help eviction is illegal. That is where the landlord will change the locks. Yeah, I see you, Misty. Misty, it's okay. Take a second. Breathe, girl. We're going to find the unmute. Okay, yeah, all right. We're going to find it.
All right, so if the city declared the tap water unfit, how is the landlord supposed to fix that? Wouldn't it be the city that would have to control the chemicals and the stuff through their sanitation of the water? How is that the landlord's responsibility?
Misty, stay within the question, girl. We are not worried about the municipality and going after them. This is not Flint, Michigan, okay? This is not Camp Lejeune. This is a question on the Residential Rental Agreements Act. That was just an example of being declared unfit. Of course, the landlord could be obligated to put a reverse osmosis system to provide safe drinking water to somebody if they're going to rent it out. It could be the seller's obligation because, as we all know, the government does not always fix things like they're supposed to, but they can still make us do it. But don't go down that rabbit hole with this question. That's not what this question is about. Yeah. They're like, hold on, this city, we got to talk to them. No. Yeah, she was right. She was trying to protect the people. Remember, I told you don't ever answer questions with emotions. If you answer any of these test questions with emotions, you are in trouble. So we were just talking about the Residential Rental Agreements Act. Now we're talking about the Tenant Security Deposit Act of North Carolina. It is a very specific act that outlines that all tenant security deposits have to be held in escrow accounts, meaning we're holding other people's monies. It is very similar to earnest money if you think about it, because it's money that's held in an account that says if you screw up, the landlord is going to take this. It's trust money. So the Tenant Security Deposit Act says you have to hold it in a trust account. Now, the other thing that the Tenant Security Deposit Act does is it outlines allowable uses and sets limits on how much you can charge for these tenant security deposits. Well, the allowable uses: terminating a lease early, damage to the property, unpaid utilities, cost of re-renting, things of that nature. You are not allowed to deduct for general wear and tear. So like cleaning the unit or anything like that, just for between move out, that is just an expectation that you have to do it. So you cannot deduct for general wear and tear, but damage to the property, sure. Now, when we're dealing with the limits, they are different depending on the tenancy. I'll talk about that in just a second. Now, understand that the Tenant Security Deposit Act applies to individual landlords managing their own property, as well as real estate brokers managing properties as property managers. So when we're dealing with regulating the amounts of the tenant security deposits, you'll see in a second that it is based on if it is a week-to-week, month-to-month, or anything longer than month-to-month, and they can change the limit. Now, one of the biggest things that gets violated from the Tenant Security Deposit Act point of view every single time is this right here. The Tenant Security Deposit Act of North Carolina states that they have to provide you accounting, meaning tell you how much money they deducted and why, and disbursement of the tenant security deposit within 30 days of the end of your tenancy. Doesn't always happen that way. Now, the rule does go on to state that they can give you interim accounting within 30 days, so long as they give final disbursement and final accounting within 60 days. The reason that would come into play is maybe there's some complex repairs and they couldn't get a quote on it just yet. So they say, here's what we've come up with thus far. We'll get you a final answer within 60 days. So in general, 30 days. But if it's not possible, interim accounting in 30 days and final disbursement and accounting within 60 days. So the limits are going to make a little bit of sense to you. If you've ever rented anything, you've probably seen this before. So I told you there are limits set depending on the tenancy. If you are on a week-to-week, they can charge you up to 2 weeks worth of rent as your tenant security deposit. If you're on month-to-month, they can charge you up to a month and a half worth of rent. And if you are on anything over than month-to-month, they can charge you up to 2 months worth of rent. Which is why you will a lot of times see something that says tenant security deposit, minimum 1 month, up to 2 months depending on credit. Because if your credit's bad, they're going to go to the maximum, the 2 months that they can charge you because you are getting more than a month-to-month tenancy. Now, it also does allow a non-refundable pet fee, a reasonable one. It doesn't identify how much reasonable is, but it does state reasonable non-refundable pet fee. Please understand that that is the right to have a pet, not the right for your pet to cause damage. So if your pet was to pee on the carpet or damage anything, that is also an allowable use of the tenant security deposits. And then, as I mentioned before, these are trust monies or escrow money, so it is held in a trust or escrow account. It has to be held in a bank that is lawfully doing business in the state of North Carolina, and it has to be a federally insured depository, as per our normal trust laws in North Carolina. Of course, the owner, who is not a broker, could potentially furnish a bond, which is basically like an insurance policy with a payout limit equivalent to the amount of the security deposit if it was being held in a different depository. We don't get to do that as brokers. We would just have to make sure that it goes into a North Carolina lawfully business bank that is FDIC insured. And here's what I just said. The broker property manager can't furnish that bond. We have to have it in a North Carolina approved depository. Yet again, here's another thing I already said, and remember you have copies of all these slides. Allowable uses of the tenant security deposits. Non-payment of rents, unpaid utilities, non-fulfillment of rental periods, re-renting a property, court costs to protect something, cost of removing or storing the tenant's property. There are protection periods where you have to hold on to a tenant's property before you can dispose of it, personal property that's abandoned after like a summary ejectment. And it depends on the value. It's up to 5 days if it's less than $500, up to a week, and you have to provide notice if it's between $500 and $700, and then anything greater than that, the sheriff would handle it. But if you were storing their property, you could use that as an allowable deduction if you had to put it in a storage unit or something like that. What you got, Sam?
So if I was a landlord and I got my real estate license after this class and I collected security deposits and didn't put them in an actual bank or bond or escrow account, I just put them in Sam's bank account until they moved out, would I be breaking my broker license, any kind of laws with that?
A lot.
Really?
A lot. That is called commingling, because tenant security deposits are trust monies. They're not your money. They are the tenant's money, and they only become your money if and only if they mess up, just like earnest money. So if you mix it with even as a non-broker, Sam, you're violating the the North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act.
Well, this is all hypothetical.
Sure, hypothetical, right, yep.
Yeah.
Asking for a friend, yep.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. Even homeowners are bound by the North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act, with or without a license. And so it has to be in a trust account.
How many homeowners would actually know that?
I think a lot. Usually the person that sells it should tell you.
Well, here's the thing. If you go 80 miles an hour in a 40 miles an hour zone and you tell the cop, I didn't see the sign, are they going to let you off? You have an obligation, if you are going to become a landlord, to look into the landlord laws in your state. If you don't, that's your fault, not their fault. Yeah. So, per the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreements Act, tenants must maintain their rented premises in a blank and blank condition.
Safe and clean.
Habitable.
Clean and safe. You got it. Habitable was the landlord, not the tenant. The tenant is who we're talking about. Safe and clean. Also told you this already. Pet fees are okay. Also, please be aware, we're not going to go down this road because this is not something that they really are going to go into detail on. But please understand that service animals are not pets. You cannot charge a pet fee for a service animal. By the way, a service animal is a dog, and a dog only, that is trained to perform a task on behalf of a person with a disability.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Use a ferret.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but to my understanding, I was under the impression that that also applies for emotional support animals.
I'm going to say it again. A service animal is a dog only that is trained to perform a task for a person with a disability. The ADA has the jurisdictional authority over service animals, which means a service animal can go everywhere that people can go. Your service animal can go on a plane. That is a very different thing from an emotional support animal. Emotional support animals are recognized under fair housing. And yes, an emotional support animal can be any animal. Notice the difference though. So one of them, you can have a discussion with your landlord in regard to where you live, but you do not have to be allowed to bring your emotional support cat, peacock, or ferret onto a plane. That can be denied because only ADA recognizes the public.
Yeah, no, I know that, but when we're talking about pet deposits and stuff, I was under the impression that
That you can't charge a pet deposit for those?
for an emotional support, like a licensed emotional support animal.
And this is why we're not going to go down the rabbit hole, because these topics are CYA topics in the real world. Contact your attorney. There's so much gray. So much gray. You are allowed to ask basic questions about an emotional support animal, but when they, give you a doctor's note, that's when you basically leave it as is. And I'm not going to say whether you can or can't charge a deposit, but just understand that a service animal, you can never charge a deposit. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole, no pun intended, for your emotional support rabbit or anything. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole of the emotional support animals because they're not going to touch on those. No matter what they say, they're not. It's just, there's no one size fits all answer. It's too crazy. I'll tell you an interesting thing here dealing with residential tenant protections, folks. When we're dealing with these and long-term leases, understand that if you buy a property where there is a tenant in place and there is 10 months left on their lease, you cannot kick the tenant out. There are too many tenant protections. You have to allow them to live out their lease terms. So if you're buying an investment property with a tenant in place, you're buying it as an investment property until their tenancy ends. However, there are a couple exceptions to that. One of them deals with foreclosures. So let's say that the owner of a property stops paying and the bank forecloses on the property and there's tenants in place and this home is sold at auction. If you purchase this foreclosure at auction and you intend to occupy it yourself, you purchased it with the intent to occupy, all you have to do is give the current tenants a 90-day notice and then you can terminate their lease, kick them out, and you can move into the property. But it has to be because you intend to move into it yourself. If you don't intend to move into it yourself, no such protections exist. The other thing, understand that the government can terminate a lease. If they take a property by eminent domain, they don't have to they're like, all right, get out. Now they are typically required to pay moving cost for the tenant if they, terminate a lease under eminent domain. And then, of course, this other piece talks about the foreclosure. They are not required to vacate, but let's say that you are a tenant with a 1-year lease left and you get notice that the property is being foreclosed upon. You are allowed to terminate your lease early as the tenant if you are so inclined to do so without penalties. So let's switch gears here. I'm telling you that for long-term leases, you cannot kick them out early as long as their lease is in good standing. Okay, there are a lot of protections for long-term residential leases. Not commercial, but long-term residential. Well, there is a different type of lease that acts differently than that. In North Carolina, we have what we call the NC Vacation Rental Act. So understand that a vacation rental is defined as tenancy of less than 90 days where the tenant has a primary residence elsewhere that they intend to return to. So week-long rentals fall under the Vacation Rental Act. So let's say that Adriana has a beach house, okay? And it is booked out for the next 6 years. It is a very popular beach house. And I win the lottery and I look at that beach house and I say, I want to live there. So I pick up the phone and I call Adriana and I offer her $10 million for a beach house. So it's booked for the next 6 years, but because they are all vacation rentals, when I close on the property, I only have to honor the leases that are up to 180 days after closing. Anything outside of that, I could return their deposits and tell them, go find a new beach house for their vacation. So you do not have to honor all leases that are already agreed upon for vacation rentals, only up to 180 days after closing. Now, here's where you get the mini lesson that we're about to talk about when we talk discuss the non-freehold estates. Remember, a vacation rental is what we call an estate for years. Very specific start date, very specific end date. When your time is up, get out. As such, vacation rentals allow for an expedited eviction. You only have to give a 4-hour oral or written notice to the tenant of your intent to go to the magistrate and kick them out by way of a summary ejectment. Expedited eviction. You can have them removed in the same day. Does not take it nearly as long as it does for the long-term residential leases. What you got, Jacob?
Do short-term rentals like vacation rentals, do those still fall under fair housing laws in terms of like discrimination and everything like that? Or are you able to?
Yeah, yet again, we're not going down that rabbit hole because there are plenty of them that say no kids. Well, that is a huge fair housing violation, but they are not necessarily looked in the same light. Outside of the scope of the test, let's just leave it at that. Yeah. It's a good question, but yeah. Now, one other thing to understand from the vacation rental point of view is, of course, the way that monies are handled. Folks, when we're dealing with vacation rentals, you typically pay for it all up front, or at least a big chunk or deposit up front. And as such, because it is in advance of actually staying there, you are limited from actually utilizing or dispersing the money from your account. So it would need to go into a trust account and be held until they actually occupied the property. So it says landlord or real estate broker cannot disperse prior to them taking possession of the property any amount greater than 50%. So let's say it's a $5,000 a week stay. You would not be able to disperse more than, administrative fees and up to 50% of that $5,000 because of the nature for cancellations and refunds being due and all those different things and the fact that they haven't even stayed yet. One last thing you could see in regard to vacation rentals, and this is also really good personal knowledge because we were talking about hurricanes a little bit ago. Folks, the North Carolina Vacation Rental Act states that if you were offered rental insurance, vacation rental insurance, and it includes mandatory evacuations, and as long as the insurance offered to you did not exceed 8% of the total cost of your stay, you better get it, because if they offer it to you and it meets those criteria and you deny it and a hurricane comes through and a mandatory evacuation is issued, you are not owed a refund. So I'll say it again. If you are offered insurance that covers mandatory evacuations, it costs less than 8% or less of the total value of your stay, and you deny it, you are not owed a refund for a mandatory evacuation. If they don't offer it to you, they owe you a refund. If it exceeds 8% and you deny or you turn it down, they would owe you a refund. Now, if you remember when those hurricanes came through North Carolina, there was a bunch of news stories where people were up in arms. Well, I booked a $5,000 a week beach stay and it was evacuated and they're not going to refund me my money. This is why. Because they were offered the insurance and they turned it down.
What if they weren't offered insurance? Then they would be required to refund them the money?
Correct.
Okay.
So if you were ever traveling during hurricane season and they offer you insurance and these criteria are met, you better buy that insurance because it's going to be your luck. There's going to be mandatory evacuation that week. We know how North Kakalaki likes to do with them hurricanes. So here's the quick little recap on the non-freehold estates, folks. And these are the things that do not really act like they sound. I just gave you the recap on one, but we talked about these week one of this class when we got into estates. So the estates were divided into the two categories. Freehold, which were estates of ownership, and non-freehold, also called leasehold estates. So we've got the estate for years, also sometimes called a tenancy for years, which is very misleading because it sounds like it's for a long time, but vacation rentals are an estate for years. Commercial leases are an estate for years. What makes them an estate for years is because the last day is the last day. When your lease is up, we either renegotiate a new one or you get out. Those are your options. The end date is the end date is the end date. That's what makes it an estate for years. Could be for 10 years, could be for 2 days, could be for 1 week. It's nothing to do with timing. It has to do with the fact that there's no automatic renewal. When it's done, it's done. Periodic tenancy, also sometimes called an estate from period to period, is basically when you have a renewal that is built into it. It will automatically renew in some way, shape, or form. Most residential leases do this. So you'll sign a 1-year lease, and it typically will require some type of notice. If you don't provide 30-day, 60-day, or whatever written notice of your intent to vacate, it will automatically renew at another year, month to month, or whatever. That is what makes it a periodic tenancy. That automatic renewal unless you provide notice of your intent to not renew. That's the differentiation between those two. And then remember, an estate at will is just with permission, not typically outlined of any money or time. We didn't have that conversation. Stay here as long as you like. Stay here until you get your divorce. Stay here until you get back on your feet. It's there with permission, but there's no money, there's no time. We could end it at any time.
And does that have to be written?
No. And then an estate at sufferance is typically somebody who gained possession of a leasehold estate by one of these other 3 methods, but when they were asked to leave, they didn't. It's called an estate at sufferance. Your time is up, you didn't move out. So folks, let's say that you had an estate for years, a 1-week beach rental. At the end of the week, you were still there on Monday and you were supposed to check out Sunday. You are now in a state at sufferance. You didn't leave when you were supposed to. Now, this last piece says, in some cases, better to not accept rent. What it means is if you're going to take them to court and evict them. If they pay you rent and say, oh, I'm sorry for still being here, here's a check. If you cash it, that shows that you're okay with it. You would want to hold on to it, write void, and send it back, or just hold on to it, write void, so in court you can prove that you're not getting the money, and then they're going to side with you more favorably in court. So this is more flashcard level stuff, folks. There is nothing crazy in depth here. These are all different types of leases, very similar to when we talked about the type of repayment plans for loans. A fixed lease, also called a gross lease, is just a flat rate. This is how much you pay each month. Most residential leases are flat or fixed or gross leases, whatever you want to call them. Pay $1,800 a month, $2,300 a month, whatever it is. The reason they're called a gross lease, as we just used that term gross, that means before expenses. Well, folks, if you're renting a property and something breaks, who has to pay to fix it?
Landlord.
The landlord. So what you're paying to them is a gross amount. They're not netting that amount. You see how that works? They have to make payments on their mortgage. They have to pay to fix things. So it is a gross amount being paid to them. They still have expenses to pay. So that's called a gross lease. A percentage lease is very commonly utilized with retail commercial space. Shopping malls loved percentage leases. So it would be like a base rent. You've got this unit and it's $3,000 a month. Plus, it would be some type of percentage of income or profits. Very specifically, income or profits. So maybe, 1% of all sales over $200,000 on top of your monthly. That'd be a percentage lease. Retail space loves percentage leases. You can see the benefit, right? A tenant getting started pays less because they're not making money yet. And a landlord likes it because eventually, the more money you make, the more money they make. So it is a very big and common type of retail lease, percentage. Base rent plus some percentage of income or profits. Now, a net lease is sometimes referred to as a triple net lease, or NNN. You may see it as NNN, triple net lease. This is very common with things like restaurants. And so it is called a net because, as the word net implies, it is after expenses. So let me explain this. You have a base amount that you are paying to your landlord, and then you are also responsible for what we call TICAM, taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. And so if the AC breaks, you fix it as the tenant. If the alarm system breaks, you fix it as the tenant. Paying the taxes, you do it. Insurance, you do it. So that's why we call it a net lease. What you pay as the monthly fee to the landlord is what they are netting, because you're responsible for some or all of the property expenses. Very common in restaurant leases. Justin, is that what you have for doing hair? Yeah, the net lease. It's for the birds, ain't it, Justin? Yeah. It's like, oh, pipes broke? You fix it. Yep, that's right. No fun. So if you see TICAM, taxes, insurance, common area maintenance, that's what that stands for. Graduated lease, we talked about the graduated repayments from a financing point of view. Same concept here. It's step-ups. So it may be, once again, for an entry-level business, your first 3 years are at this level, your next 3 years are at this level, your next 3 years are at this level. It's just intervals in which it would go up. 5 years, 10 years, every year, doesn't matter. It's whatever you negotiate. And then the last one is called a ground lease. Folks, it's dirt. There are a couple different types of ground leases, but you are just renting the land. Believe it or not, Wally World, Walmart, loves ground leases. They actually lease these giant parcels of land and build Walmart on them. Yeah, if you didn't know this, they do. Walmart does not own 90% of their stores where the dirt is. They own the building, so they will negotiate with the person who owns the land, and they will sign a lease the land, and then build these $1 million buildings. Well, as you might imagine, if they're building these big old buildings, these leases, they're for like 100 years typically. And what they're basically designed to do is after 100 years, they will just let the buildings go back to the property owners, and then they will just wash, rinse, repeat. Now, yet again, you don't have to understand why, but the reason is taxes. If they own it, they have assets that are appreciating in value. If they don't own it, everything they pay in rent is tax deductible, so it lowers their taxable income, and so they save more money. There's reasons people do this stuff. It's outside of our scope of... But ground leases are very... Golden Corral's the same. Golden Corral loves to do that too. Of course, there are more simplistic ground leases like mobile home parks, where the property owner owns the piece of dirt, and then you would just rent the dirt underneath your manufactured home, and then you own the manufactured home as personal property. Is that what you were about to say, Dora?
I was just going to ask you that, yep.
Yep, that is a more simplistic version of a ground lease, but it is still a ground lease. You're just renting the dirt underneath, and then you put your personal property on it. Be the same thing too of like a RV park, right? You were renting that space, but then you got your camper on it.
So the, not pipes, but I guess, the sewer system.
Typically, if it's on sewer, it's obviously tied into a municipal, but just like anything else, it's metered. And so you would have a meter box, and so you would pay your own independent sewer meter, your own electric meter. You would have your own meter connection, just like when you rent a house. You take over the electricity, you take over the water. Same thing with a ground lease. You would take over now sometimes they are negotiated where it's all covered in the area. It's just like some apartment complexes, water is one set fee each month because everybody shares it. It could be negotiated, but most of the time it's metered and you have your own responsibility there. Now, of course, I just outlined every single one of these. Those of you who are visual, here's a real quick rundown for... I'm sorry, these are different ones. I was thinking that we were going to go through all of them. Let me explain these. I apologize. Full service lease and index lease didn't make it onto that chart, but they are two more that we need to talk about. Full service leases are very commonly utilized with Class A office space. Office space is broken into categories very often. Class A is newer, higher finishes, nicer amenities. And so full service lease is where you pay one price, typically a higher price, and everything's included. The electricity, the water, the internet, the utilities, the cleaning companies, all of it is included. The reason they do this is because they want to match a certain aesthetic for every tenant within the office building. And then they also don't want 700 different service providers, water bills, things of that nature. So it's called a full service lease. It includes everything for one price, typically more expensive. And then an index lease is fluctuating, kind of like an adjustable rate mortgage on the consumer price index. I'll give you an example here. Government subsidized housing like Section 8, it is typically based on percentages of people's income, and that percentage would be based on, number one, the person's hardships, And number two, the consumer price index. Of course, as the cost of living goes up, they would subsidize different amounts. And so it would just go up or down based on the consumer price index, based on where we are in inflation, recession, and things of that nature. That's all you really need to know. It goes up and down based on the consumer price index. So I'm going to put this next slide up, and I'm going to ask you a question based on what you see. This next slide is the essential elements of a valid lease. I want you to look at this list, and I want you to tell me if that sounds like anything to you.
Like a contract.
A contract. That's exactly right, folks. Do not forget that leases are contracts. Sales contracts are contracts. Agency agreements are contracts. Promissory notes are contracts. A lot of different things that we have talked about throughout this class are a contract, and as such, they would all need the essential elements of a basic contract law. Mutual agreement of the parties, consideration, legally competent parties, and for legal and lawful objectives. Contracts, leases are contracts. They are. So let me ask you some questions on some of the things we just talked about. A lease with a specific beginning and ending date that does not automatically renew is referred to as a what?
And it's for years?
State for years, also called a tenancy for years, very commonly associated with vacation rentals and commercial rentals. How about this one? This lease is very common with retail tenants where the tenant pays a portion of their sales revenue in addition to their monthly rent.
Percentage.
Bam.
Percentage.
Percentage lease. There you go. There you go. Now, the last couple notes with these conversations, folks, we've already kind of talked about some of this in the contract section. When we're dealing with contracts and under basic contract law, one of the things that we said contracts could be was assigned. An assignment is changing the parties. Now, I will warn you, you just got to be very careful on what the question's asking you, because sometimes an assignment transfers all rights. Sometimes it is transferring less than all rights, which is kind of what a sublease is. But let me explain the difference here. If you were to assign a contract, under most circumstances, it went from this person to this person. More often than not, you would maintain a secondary form of liability, regardless of what everybody says. It is possible to transfer your full liability, so it would just depend on the context of the question. Some instances, you would completely absolve yourself, like a loan assumption. If you allow somebody to assume your loan, that is an assignment. The loan's the same, the parties are different, but the bank is not going to look at you for coming back if they don't pay it. Now, that's not true of all loans. VA loans maybe. So sometimes we transfer all interest and we don't maintain any liability in an assignment. Sometimes we have a secondary form of liability. Now, let me show you the reason why this is very different than a sublease. In a sublease, if this person is paying $500 a month to rent this bedroom, and they want to sublease this out, now this person is paying $500 a month to this person who's paying $500 a month to this person. So the sublease, you don't actually get removed. You are just the middleman at that point because they're not taking you off. Depends on what your contract states, what you can and can't do. Some will or won't allow subleasing. Some will or won't allow assignments. Some will or won't allow full-fledged assignments. So just understand that these terminologies exist with contracts. Maintaining full secondary liability, little secondary liability, or completely absolving yourself depending on the context of the question.
So an assignment would remove you from this situation.
Once again, depends on the context. It does not always, even though it says it, it does not always. Sometimes you are still maintaining a level of secondary liability. It would really depend on the context. It would really depend on the contract and what we all agreed on. So that's where this comes into play right here. In most cases, neither of these removes total responsibility from the first tenant. It is possible to be completely removed, but a lot of times you're still there in some way, shape, or form. And that's true of all contracts. It's possible to be completely removed. Sometimes you're not. Don't overthink it. Just be very careful on questions. Do not just automatically think that assignment means you are absolved. Read the context of the question. So, termination of leases, folks, don't go, too crazy here. Leases are contracts, and so leases terminate very similar to any other contract. Mutual agreement. If certain terms expire, like leases having a time frame, that would kill it. Of course, remember I told you, destruction of the property would kill leases. Why? Because they are property specific. Any agreement that is property specific does die with death of the property. So if the property burns down, the lease dies. There's nothing to rent anymore. If the property management agreement would also die with destruction of the property. Condemnation proceeding, the government takes it by eminent domain. I told you they can and do terminate leases. Now they do maintain some liability to help pay moving costs when they terminate a rental property by way of eminent domain. And then of course, failure to perform, breach of contract, not paying rent would allow you to terminate it. And the non-breaching party can always go after the breaching party. So very similar to the contracts discussion, because they are contracts and they are property specific contracts. Now here's where I'll just provide some clarity. Now don't run with this, because typically, folks, I told you, real estate, there's a default setting, but there is basically an exception to everything. There is. Very few absolutes in real estate. Be very careful on the test. If there's any absolute, you got to read it very carefully. I'm not saying there's none, but let me give you the example that I'm talking about here. I told you that when you are transferring these rights, you transfer the right of possession, the right of enjoyment, and the right of exclusion to the tenant. Well, as such, that means that the property owner, even though they are the owner, does not have the right to just barge into your house and open your pantry and start eating your cornflakes, okay? They can't do that. But there is typically provisions written into most lease agreements that say under certain time frames with adequate notice that they can come and investigate the property, and of course that they may be allowed to enter under emergency situations where house or harm could come to somebody, or harm could come to the house or somebody. So it goes with that right of possession being transferred and the right of exclusion, but they a lot of times write in that they can access the property in certain ways, just to check and make sure you're not doing anything you're not supposed to. So let me ask you this question. This type of lease rents the land to the tenant, and the tenant would usually build an improvement on the property. Of course, they could just rent the land, but building on it is typically part of this. What do we call that?
Ground lease.
Ground lease. Wally World loves it. Ground lease. Leases greater than 3 years must be in writing as required by
Statute of frauds.
Statute of frauds. Leases on real property exceeding 3 years are required to be in writing per the North Carolina Statute of Frauds. Leases less than 3 years or 3 years or less are not required to be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. It's only if they're 3 years or more. So statute of frauds, which leads us into, bam, the next one, property management. Now, this one, folks, we're not going to spend a lot of time on in any way, shape, or form. This is really self-explanatory. The only things that you could absolutely see that are going to be like, well, what are the duties of a property manager? If you think about it, you really know everything that you could possibly know about property management in a nutshell. The property manager is maintaining the property for the property owner and trying to realize whatever outcome the property owner desires. Please understand that management is not a one-size-fits-all. You are basically a business manager because, as you saw in that income capitalization approach, most properties do make money. And you've got employees and you've got different pieces and you've got monies coming in and you've got monies coming out. So a big part of being a property manager is, of course, adequate reporting to your client and maintaining their investment, making sure that you maintain it, it doesn't go to waste, you have adequate policies, you are trying to meet whatever it is that they're looking for. Some people have properties as long-term holdings. They don't need to make cash flow. They just want to be net zero and they will eventually sell them for a profit. Other people use them for business deductions. Other people hold them for cash flow. There is no one size fits all in regard to managing a property on behalf of somebody. Now, please understand that from a mathematical point of view, commissions are calculated very similarly. When we did sales, it was typically a commission percentage of the sales price. On these, it is typically a percentage monthly on the gross income that you receive. The EGI, effective gross income, what's actually paid. So when we're dealing with property managers and some of the more specific North Carolina sides of property management, do understand that there are a lot of laws and rules. Remember, on day one, when we talked about needing a license, one employee of a broker property manager was a named exemption, and they said we could do certain things, not full-fledged exemption, but certain things without a license, like show properties for lease on behalf of their broker property manager boss. They could give lease agreements and instruct people where to sign. They could collect tenant security deposits and rent monies, act as a courier, things of that nature. But they would never be allowed to negotiate. Now, I'm going to point out this non-provisional. It says property manager for others must have an active non-provisional real estate broker working under a signed property management agreement. In most instances, folks, while it doesn't state it in some of this material, a property manager would also have to be a BIC. And the reason being, you have to have a trust account 99% of the time to be a property manager. Only a BIC can have a trust account in North Carolina unless it's for their own personally owned properties. So a property manager would have to be both a full broker and a BIC in order to actually really be able to do their job. What you got, Jacob?
So if it's for somebody else's property, you have to be a BIC to have an account.
But what about for an individual who isn't licensed at all, managing their own properties? Are they able to have
A trust account?
Yeah.
Yeah. An individual is and should have a trust account as a non-broker managing their own properties, as Sam and I were talking about earlier. And so anybody can open a trust account and you'd be required to have one. However, when you get your license, the laws and rules kind of change. And so here's what it says. A licensed broker who is managing their own personal investment properties can have a trust account for that purpose, even though they are not a BIC. But the rule is you better not put anybody's money in there other than tenant security deposits for your own personal properties, and you better not mix your money in there. But if you are trying to have a trust account for rentals that you're managing for others, you would have to be a BIC. You see the difference there? The exception exists for a broker who's managing their own properties. You don't have to be a BIC to have that trust account so long as it's for your own investment rental security deposits. No. That being said, folks, go take a break. Come back at 8:40. Whoop, whoop. So, talking about property managers, remember when we were talking about the exemptions, I told you an employee of a broker property manager can do very limited things, so they're named as a slight exemption. But then we also talked about employees of an entity owner of real property. They're full-fledged exemption. Just like you don't need a license to manage your own property, an employee of an entity that owns real estate does not need a license to manage their property. And they can negotiate. They can do all the things that an owner could do as an employee of an entity owner. So make sure you keep that straight in your head. Now, when we're talking about the employee of a broker property manager, they have to be paid as an hourly or salary employee. They cannot be paid on a per transactional or commission basis, because that would be paying them like a real estate broker, and that's not allowed. Now, pop quiz from way back in the agency section. When we talked about levels of power or tiers of authority, we said that a property manager would serve at what level of authority?
General?
General agency. Because they are typically allowed to do some very specific things and bind their client to certain things. Like they may be able to bind them to certain leases. They may be able to bind them to repairs or to repairs on their behalf. So a general agent has some scope of authority to bind somebody to something. And so that is when you're typically acting as a general agent. The other time that we were calling you a general agent, typically you as a real estate broker affiliated with a firm, your independent contractors agreement creates a general agency relationship where you can bind your real estate firm to agency contracts. So when we're dealing with this, there is a slight differentiation that I would impress upon you. I don't know that they're still testing you to this extent, but they do, oddly enough, they identify two different pieces of a property manager: their primary function and their primary responsibility. Their primary function is to preserve the value of an investment property while generating income for the owner. That's their function. Preserve the value of an investment property while generating income for the owner. Now, their primary responsibility, this is where I said that it depends on the wishes of your client. Realize the highest return on the property that is consistent with the owner's instructions. That is your responsibility. So primary function versus primary responsibility could be something that comes up. Now, of course, when we talked about relationships, this is where things come full circle. As a property manager, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go back because that one is kind of a specific one. So some of you are still taking notes on that one. I'll give you just a few more seconds before I say the next thing. Just a reminder that I need to see your bright, shiny, smiley faces on camera. There we go. So, all property management agreements have to be in writing. Remember, in North Carolina, all agency contracts have to be in writing. Some states would recognize implied, so you could see that on the national, but all all agency contracts will ultimately have to be in writing in North Carolina. The only one that can start off orally is that buyer agency agreement, and it would ultimately have to be reduced to writing at some point. So property management agreements have to be in writing from the offset. Does have to contain the description of the property. Would talk about how long the period of time is for. Now, when we talked about agency contracts, we said that all written agency agreements need to have, certain things. And one of those was a definite expiration date. Well, this is still true with a property management agreement. It does have to have a definite expiration date. But oddly enough, this is the one that allows an automatic renewal. There is no automatic renewals allowed in buyer agency agreements or listing agreements. But because of the nature of leases, a property management agreement can have an automatic renewal. So it would have similar verbiage about renewals. It would say that you would have to provide X amount of notice within X amount of time with your intent to terminate our agency relationship, this property management relationship. And if you don't, then it will automatically renew at a successive term of 1 year, 6 months, or whatever it may be. Okay, so this can have an automatic renewal in a property management agreement. The other thing that's outlined in there is how you get paid. And I told you, it's just like commissions. It's percentages, but it is percentages of your effective gross income. So not what you could make, not the potential, but what you're actually grossing each month. And so we're typically not getting paid when a unit is vacant. And so if you were managing one property, just to put this in perspective for you, if you were managing one property and the monthly rent was $1,700, let's say that you're getting paid 10%, you would make $170 a month off managing that one property. Of course, you can see the allure of being a property manager, because if you were managing a portfolio of 6,000 properties a month, it's a lot of money. Of course, 6,000 is a lot. The other things outlined is, of course, your responsibilities, what type of reports, how often are you going to fulfill them, are you ordering repairs, are you handling eviction proceedings. All this is outlined in your property management agreement. Like I said, there's not too many other things I want to get into here. Most of this stuff is self-explanatory. Yeah, we're talking about that. We're good. Management plans, we're good. Fair housing, I do want to talk about this for a second. We're going to talk about fair housing in just a few moments in general. But understand that if you are the property manager, one of your responsibilities is typically screening tenants. So you have to apply a uniform screening criteria that is fair and not discriminatory. Criminal background checks and credit checks are acceptable forms of screening as long as you're doing them for everybody. You cannot consider arrest records, though. That is unlawful. But background checks and credit report checks are lawful as long as you are only considering arrests and you are doing them for everybody. So we'll talk about the fair housing jazz more in a moment as we get into the next section. Of course, part of your job, prepare a management plan, kind of estimate what the costs are going to be, estimate what you think the money is going to be, put together an operating budget, and then you're going to provide the reports, market the property, fill in tenants, screen the tenants, come up with policies, make sure you have the adequate insurances. A lot of things that you would think would be the property manager's job if you just think about it a little bit. Of course, the slides go on to name a few more, but I'll give you just one more second on this slide. So collecting rents and security deposits, maintaining the property, establishing rules for multi-tenant properties. What do we mean? Policies for the pool, policies for the picnic tables, the picnic areas, dog parks, car wash, thing like that. Initiating eviction proceedings. I told you they can only do that as the property manager if they're the ones actually collecting the money. So we know that they are in delinquency or default on paying on time. Just a few more added into the mix here. Maintaining records, preparing reports, providing them. I told you, you were basically managing a business. If you're a property manager, you're looking at the inflows, the outflows, just handling everything like a business, and it is one. The way that you are judged as a property manager, I told you, is by your NOI, the net operating income. The better your NOI, the better you are as a property manager. One supplemental note, I don't know if they'll throw it in the mix on your test, but just be aware, there is sometimes provisions, and in ours there is, a provision where you could negotiate or help them sell the property to a tenant. There's basically outlined in there that, hey, if the tenant wants to buy the property, we may help facilitate that sale and we may be entitled to some type of commission. However, that does not make it a lease agreement. If they ever wanted to list it and actively market it, you would have to sign a separate listing agreement to do so. It typically just states that you can assist in selling it to a tenant, that specific tenant who's renting it. That is one thing that is allowed, but not a full-fledged listing agreement. You would have to sign a full-fledged listing agreement if they wanted to market it and treat it that way. Now, we just got done before we got into this section with the valuation section, and we talked about properties for sale, except for when we talked about gross rent multipliers. Well, please understand, if you are a property manager, you would do a CMA for a property for lease, just like you would a property for sale. So what you would look at is recently rented properties, what they rented for, what their features were, and make adjustments based on the features of your subject property versus the comparable rentals. And you would just add and subtract. Same concept, just dealing with rental prices and features versus sales prices and features. So this is lining here. Establishing rental rates for an income producing property, most consideration to a market analysis of neighboring competitive properties, making adjustments, just like you would for a CMA, for these rentals. Now, of course, some of the things we're talking about in here are residential, some of them are commercial, most of them are residential. But here on the next slide, I'll give you a second on this one. The next thing is a little bit commercial, or a lot of it commercial. So here's the thing that I was talking about, okay? Upfitting. When you're renting commercial, it's typically a very high dollar kind of scenario depending on the commercial property. And so sometimes they will do what's called an upfitting, which is where they basically build it to suit what you need or add things that you would need for your business. For a restaurant, sometimes the commercial property owner may purchase all the kitchen equipment and put it in there for you, and then they would just roll it into your lease and collect their money back that way. Sometimes it's installing the sinks and the vanities for a somebody who does hair for a living. Sometimes it is, adding walls and building, sections for a department store. So upfitting is something that is regularly negotiated with commercial properties where they will do it for you and then just roll a cost into your lease to recoup that money. And then the next one we've already talked about as well. It's cash flow. And so this should look familiar. There's your please vacuum every office nightly, which is how we calculate our net operating income, or NOI, using the income capitalization approach, right? We would take the NOI and divide it by a cap rate to figure out a value. But either way, this is what a cash flow report looks like. It's just you would stop with NOI for the income capitalization approach. But I told you your NOI minus your debt service equals your before tax cash flow, more specifically. So please vacuum every office nightly. And so your before tax cash flow means the amount that you have made before you pay your taxes. And so then your after tax cash flow is expendable income. You can spend it. That is money that you have made and it's profit for you to spend. Now, let me just explain this while we're talking about property management, and then we're basically done here after I give you a couple examples of some investment concepts. Folks, leverage is the concept of utilizing other people's money to finance an investment. When you borrow money, you are leveraging other people's money. Let me explain the value of this from an investment point of view. If you were to buy a house for $100,000, And then let's say that you turn around and you sold that house for $125,000 down the road. And this is an oversimplification, but you'll get what I mean. Folks, you did not make $125,000. You got your $100,000 back as a return on your investment, okay? But you profited $25,000. So if you were to look at this as a percentage of what you made, $25,000, divided by what you paid, $100,000, that is your percent of return on your investment. And so 25,000 divided by your $100,000 investment would be a 25% return on your investment. Now watch what happens. If you were to take this same $100,000 and you were to split it 5 ways, and instead you put $20,000 down on 5 different properties that all cost $100,000 and you borrowed the rest. You still invested $100,000 of your own money between these 5 properties. Still $100,000. Let's say that you later turn around and sell every single one of these for $125,000. Well, now you have made $25,000 times 5. So you made $125,000 and you invested $100,000. That is a 125% return on that same investment. That is called leverage, folks. Using other people's money to finance things and realize a greater return. Same $100,000 that you invested, much bigger return. That's leverage. Now we talked about equity. Remember, what is equity?
It's what you owe versus what it's worth.
Yep, what you could sell for minus what you owe to the banks. That's your equity. The 3 ways that you increase equity: appreciation, meaning the value goes up; debt service, meaning you pay down your principal balance; or capital improvements, making the property more valuable. I just basically did that for you, but you can see it. It's a prettier version than what I did. But this is just showing return on your investment. If your purchase price is $100,000 sales, that's just showing your 25% return on your investment, just like I just showed you, versus the 125% if you would leverage that money differently. Now, cap rates we've already talked about. Cap rate is just the rate of return on your investment. Of course, it depends on the market, the type of property it is. I think we've already done that. I'm not going to do this again. Risk management, making sure you have the proper insurances. We're fine on that. Insurance, same thing. We're fine. Commissions, here's just a visual calculation. Once again, this is back in 1990, never, when your rent was $475 a month. If you were charging an 8% commission on a monthly, $475, and then we asked for your annual, how much you're making, $475 times your 8% would be $38 a month times 12. And you can calculate how much you're making each year. If you're managing 17 properties, you would just 17 plus or whatever they're renting for. If they're all different rates, you'd add them all up. It's just percentages. That's all it is. I'm going to warn you, I'm about to ask you a question, and it's a very mean question, so pay attention to it. I know, I got to warn you about this. True or false, a property manager's primary responsibility is to preserve the value of an investment property while generating income for the property owner?
False.
False. Why?
The primary function is to preserve the value of an investment property.
Yeah, I told you it's a very mean question, right? This is such a silly little nuance that those words make such a difference. But yeah, that's false. That is the definition of a property manager's primary function. The primary responsibility is to realize the highest return on the property that is consistent with the owner's instructions. Let's see if you caught this in the brief time that I did it. What is the formula for calculating the percent of your profit or the percent of the return on your investment?
You divide what you got your
your profit, what you made.
by what you invested.
There you go. What you made divided by what you paid. That's it. What your profit was divided by what your initial investment was. That'll give you your percent of profit. And remember, it's going to come out as a decimal, but that's a percentage. So 0.25 is 25%. 0.75 is 75%. This would be 0.17, but it's 17%. Bam! That's the last slide in that grouping. Look at that. I tell you what. So here's the last couple sections. Let me explain how we're going to kind of tackle these, folks. The next one that we're going to get into is fair housing. Fair housing is important. We're going to talk about it. Federal income taxation of real property ownership. We don't even need the slides. I'm going to tell you the 3 important things about it. And then the last one that is in this grouping, I believe, basic construction. I'm not going to go over construction because you have slides in the online system that tells you everything you need to know. Look at the syllabus. Construction is so minorly testable that we don't need to even go over construction. So what we're going to do is finish. This is only like 40 slides. So I'm going to try to get as far in these slides as I can tonight. That means that the only thing after tonight that we have not gone over completely, but we have gone over partially, is the last couple things of North Carolina license law and commission rules. We've already gone over some of it because that's where we started this class with your statuses, active versus current, post-licensing. But there are a couple other miscellaneous laws and rules that we need to discuss outside of what we've been talking through the rest of this class. So tomorrow night will be first 45 minutes, license laws, commission rules. The rest of the class, review. There you go. So let's talk about fair housing, folks. And let me give you some word of caution, as I have done many times, but let me reiterate it. Folks, you cannot answer any test question in any way, shape, or form with emotions. Don't do it. I don't care whether you like it, hate it, or otherwise. Only answer it based on what I've taught you, what you've read, what you have learned, not what you feel. Let me tell you what I mean. Not all discrimination is illegal. And if you answer a test question saying that all discrimination is illegal, you have gotten the question wrong. Point blank, period. I'm going to say that again. Not all discrimination is illegal. Discrimination is not nice, it's not pretty, it's not fair, it's not right, it's disgusting. But that is not what we're asking you. We're asking you if it's legal or illegal. Not all of it is illegal. Does everybody accept that statement? Okay. So the purpose of the Fair Housing Act in general, folks, was ultimately to state that if you can afford to live somewhere, you should be allowed to live somewhere. That's it, in a nutshell. The whole premise is that people should not be discriminated based on certain protected classes that would prevent them from occupying somewhere that they live. Now, of course, it has evolved a lot over the years, so we've got to start somewhere, and that is with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. For whatever reason, the years are testable. I hate it, but it's true. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed, and what it stated was that nobody should be discriminated against for any reason based on race or color. That is what the Civil Rights Act stated. This meant in work, this meant in purchasing of property, this meant in general. Nobody should be discriminated based on the premise of race or color. Those two and those two only. Now, I'm going to tell you something here. There are no exceptions to the Civil Rights Act. Any discrimination based off of race or color is always a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So rest assured knowing that. There are no exceptions for the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Everybody okay with that statement? Any discrimination based on race or color, and folks, any race or color. It's not just one race or color. If you were to discriminate against somebody because they were Caucasian or white, that's discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. If you were to discriminate against somebody who was African American or black, race or color. Now, of course, when we get into, some of these ethnicity conversations, things get a little bit weird, so we're not there yet, but race or color, whatever you are or the color of your skin, that's the criteria. So I'm going to, there you go, let me just skip forward here. Civil Rights Act of 1866, there's a number. Prohibited discrimination in anything, not just the sale of the property, but that was a big part of it. There are no exceptions to this one. Civil Rights Act of 1866. Well, folks, understand that, please understand too that this also had its hiccups. Did everybody abide by this law? No. And in fact, one of the presidents tried to repeal it, and then it was brought back into play, but that's not the history lesson that we need to go into. So, no exceptions for the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, please understand that this was the only piece of discrimination legislation in place in this regard for 102 years. We did not actually have the Federal Fair Housing Act until 1968. And when they passed the Federal Fair Housing Act, what they basically did was said, okay, well, we're keeping this race and color thing, but we're also going to add religion and national origin. And then that stayed for a while, and then there was the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, which added in sex. Now, the term sex means male or female in that context. Male or female. So you were not allowed to discriminate based on whether somebody was male or female. However, this is not part of the original law. In 2021, Joe Biden passed an executive order that stated that discrimination against somebody based on sexual orientation or gender identity could possibly be taken up in the federal courts at the same level based on sex. So they didn't add a new class, but they basically said we might hear it under this class. And then in 1988, they passed the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which included disability and familial status. Now, folks, I'm telling you right now, listen to me. The only one that can never be legally violated is race and color. Every single other one of these has a time and a place where you could discriminate against those protected classes if it falls under an exemption. The only one that can never be legally discriminated against is race and color. So let me make sure you understand these protected classes, and then we'll get into the exemptions here. When I say familial status, the way that you remember this, folks, is this acronym or this mnemonic. It's called Fresh Corn. If you look at more recent things, they have switched it to Fred's Corn. Same thing, but they moved this one as an H. Instead, it's a D, and they moved it up here. But for the sake of the test, you can just remember it as Fresh Corn. Now, E and O are placeholders, stands for equal opportunity for all. E and O, equal opportunity. So F is familial status, meaning whether or not you have kids or a pregnant woman expecting. That is what is protected under familial status. Kids, pregnant women. Race, physical or genetic trait shared by a group. E is that placeholder, equal rights for all. S is sex, historically male or female, now is interpreted as sexual identity and gender orientation as well. H stands for handicap or disability, whether they have one or the perceived handicap or disability, perception of disability. Color of skin. O is that placeholder, opportunity for all. R is religion, based on having one, not having one, or one different from your own beliefs. And the last one is national origin. So I'm going to say it again. The only ones that can never be discriminated against are race and color. There is a time and a place, if certain criteria are met, that people can discriminate against every single other one on this list. So let me mention a couple things here before I talk about the exemptions. Number one, I said pay attention to the dates. It's very important. not so much on my test, but on the state licensing exam, they love the dates. I don't really care about the dates, but of course, you do need to know them. The other thing is familial status, I told you, is somebody under the age of 18, a child, or women who are pregnant. Okay, that's familial status. Now, as such, this last note goes hand in hand with that. HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, said that you can have occupancy restrictions and base it based on 2 heartbeats per room. In other words, if it's a 1-bedroom house, you can deny somebody who has 2 kids and 2 parents, but you're denying them based on occupancy restrictions, not the fact that they have kids. So it is okay to not allow somebody with too many people to rent or buy, under certain HUD occupancy restrictions. As long as that has nothing to do with the fact that they're kids versus not kids. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866, before we go any further, prohibits discrimination based on what?
Race and color.
Race and color only. Okay. And then when the 102 years later, the Federal Fair Housing Act added in 2 additional categories on top of race and color. What were they?
Religion and national origin.
There you go. Religion and national origin. Then the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974 added what?
Sex.
Bam. Sex. And then the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 prohibited discrimination based on what 2 new categories?
Disability and familial status.
Disability and familial status. Now, I will remind you that this is the list for fair housing. Do not confuse it with ECOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Let me let y'all take a picture of something. I'm sure there's something in your book, but there's a certain, let's see this. There's a certain chart that I really like in one of my old textbooks. What you got, Jacob?
I have a question, and it may be mildly ignorant, but what exactly is the difference between race and national origin? And does that even matter?
It does matter. National origin is where you are from. Understand that if you get into race or ethnicity, that is typically where you would call somebody Caucasian or Hispanic or African American or things of that nature. Well, you have to understand there are white people in Africa. There are black people in France. There are Hispanic people in, Alaska. So where you are from is your national origin. But your race or your ethnicity is that broad category. When you fill out the paperwork and they say, what are you? Caucasian, African American, Hispanic, Native American, indigenous natives, they have those broad blanketed categories. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Why does my video keep turning off?
Why does your video keep turning off? Let me show you how this graph. I like this graph a lot. So y'all, I'll try to screenshot it and put it in the group me, but y'all take a picture of it too because it's helpful. Let me find it here. Wait, did I land right on it? Sweet, here it is. There you go. That one. Because you see how it breaks ECOA out of it too. So down at the bottom, you can see the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And so you can see disability and familial status are not part of ECOA. And then when you look at marital status and public assistance income, those are not part of fair housing. And age, that's not part of fair housing either. So I like this little graph. Makes it easier to kind of separate the two. So, when we're talking about the handicapping condition, understand that we talked about material facts and we mentioned this before. sometimes you can't see handicapping conditions, so it's a very broad category. Physical disability, auditory, ocular, mental impairment, somebody with depression, anxiety, PTSD, recovery from alcohol or drug abuse dependence. All of these fall under the criteria of handicapping conditions. And then we went into the fair house or the material facts discussion, and we said somebody having AIDS or HIV is protected under fair housing as well, which is why we would not be able to ever disclose that, and it's not a material fact. That'd be a violation of fair housing. Now, here's where I'm going to introduce the exemptions, because I need you to process this right now. Not this, but we're going to talk more about the handicapping conditions in a second. Folks, understand. I guess let me make this last note here before I switch gears. This last one says reasonable accommodations must be allowed, and this can be requested at any time. So this means if somebody is renting a property, and then they call the landlord or the property owner and say, hey, I would like to install a wheelchair ramp. That is a reasonable accommodation. You cannot deny a reasonable accommodation. You would have to prove that it was unreasonable. Good deal. Thanks, Jacob. You would have to prove that it's unreasonable. Now, do understand that you can't deny a reasonable accommodation or request or modification. It does not have to be at the property owner's expense. And so you could say, yeah, you can install a wheelchair ramp, but you have to pay for it. And you can also renegotiate a restoration agreement that says you have to return it to the way it was beforehand. But you have to allow reasonable accommodations. And this also falls into, of course, service animals and those emotional support animals in certain circumstances, the emotional support animals. So here is the exemptions, folks. Please understand that the federal fair housing is going to be the most testable. Historically, there have been no questions on the state fair housing on the test. I can't say absolutely the way that they recategorized it, whether there is or is not any on your state portion of your test. The reason I bring that up, because there is the federal fair housing law and there is the North Carolina state fair housing laws. They very closely mirror each other, but the exemptions are different. So from a federal point of view, when you are selling your home as a private property owner, you are exempt from adhering to fair housing laws under federal laws. Not the Civil Rights Act. So if you were to ever try to discriminate against somebody and refuse to sell it to them based on the premise of race or color, you are in the violation of the Civil Rights Act. You can never violate those. But what I'm telling you is, if a private property owner not using a broker is selling their home and they refuse to sell it to somebody who is from China, they could. Because national origin is not race or color. If they were selling their own home and they refused to sell to somebody who was Christian, they could. Because religion is not race or color. Now, of course, this is basically stating, for all intents and purposes, that you get to pick who you sell it to. But you're not allowed to use discriminatory advertising. That would still be prohibited. So you can't, put any kind of discrimination in your ad saying, no blanks from blank because I hate them blankers, that's not allowed. That'd be discrimination that would not be okay. So discriminatory advertising, still not okay. Now, of course, if you are a house flipper or an investor, this is what this is talking about. As long as you're not selling more than 3 homes per year, you can fall under this exemption. If you start selling more than 3 homes a year, then you got a problem. And of course, we can never violate fair housing. Now, let me take this a step further, because this is not the only exemption. There is another exemption that we like to call the roommate rule. So what this means, and this is still on here, so the for sale by owner is exempt as long as they don't violate the Civil Rights Act. The roommate rule states that if you are renting out a room in your house that you live in, or if you are renting out a unit in a multi-unit building that you live in, up to 1 to 4 units, you can pick and choose who you rent to so long as it's not based on race or color. And it's not a violation of fair housing. Think about it, folks. If you are a woman who owns your own house, what this means is you wanted to rent out a room, you could refuse to rent it to a man, and you are not in violation of fair housing laws. Because yes, you are discriminating based on sex, but that's not race or color. It's okay. And again, we're not going to be discriminatory in our advertising, but the whole premise of this is not so we can be discriminatory, but so people can feel safe in their own homes, whatever that looks like to them. So yet again, if somebody refused to rent a room to somebody who is Muslim, they're not in violation, as long as it's a roommate rule kicking in. Other exemptions are religious organizations. Basically what it's stating is religious like organizations, Christian schools, churches, whatever, they can refuse to rent to people who are not Christian so long as they're not limiting the people who can join their faith. That's what that means, right? So as long as they're not limiting who can become a Christian, they could limit their dwelling to Christians only, as long as they're not barring certain protected classes from joining their Christianity. Private clubs used by members would be an exemption. They're not going to test you on that one. And then, as I said, no exception where broker is involved. Does everybody understand what I'm putting down here? If you have a test question that says Kingsley owns a quadruplex and decides to rent out the other 3 units, and Kingsley has decided that he is not going to rent to the other to 3 potential tenants because they are from Chile. Kingsley has done nothing wrong under the Federal Fair Housing Act because of the roommate rule. He gets to pick and choose because he's also living there. So this is why I'm saying you don't answer questions with emotions. Don't ever look at the question and be like, that's discrimination. Yeah, it is, but it's legal discrimination.
Wouldn't it be, I mean, there's no real way to prove somebody's motive behind declining somebody, right? I mean, somebody could very well easily discriminate based off of color, race, and just play it off as something else. I'm not saying that that's not messed up, but like, there's no way to actually enforce this.
Well, here's the thing. The government does take this seriously, and so they will regularly do sting operations if people are reported on multiple cases. And so they will send a Caucasian family who looks well-to-do to go ask if there's any apartments available. And then they will send another different protected class to go ask the same question to test. And you will find that they say, oh, no, sorry, no vacancies, or no rooms available. And then they'll tell the other family that there are. And so that you can prove it. You just send people undercover to see if they're actually discriminating. So, of course, when you're dealing, folks understand that a landlord cannot discriminate. So that's why it says 1 to 4 units. You have to live there, and it has to be considered residential. If you are a landlord who owns an apartment complex, you would not be allowed to do this. So the Fair Housing Act applies to real estate brokers and residential landlords. They always have to abide by fair housing. So if we are dealing with a screening, we can never abide by, or we can never violate fair housing. And of course, these exemptions, I mean, they do sting operations to test and see if people are in violation of these.
Seth, my husband and I have rentals, and we don't like to rent to families. We only like to rent to older individuals, preferably single.
When you say families, you mean people with kids?
Yeah.
That's discrimination to the umpteenth degree. You're not allowed to do that. You got to stop. That, Misty, when I tell you got to stop now. If it's long-term rentals, there are huge violation penalties for this.
We're actually in the process of remodeling them down to 1-bedrooms.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, that's where Jacob asked earlier. There are some. Here's what you have to understand. Even folks, even if your heart is in the right place, let's say that you have an apartment complex and you don't want to rent a 2-story unit, or I'm sorry, like a 3rd or 4th floor unit to a family because you think it's dangerous for kids, you're still in trouble for discrimination. You are not allowed to pick and choose. You're still in trouble for discrimination. The idea is you should advertise things appropriately to all parties. You should not be singling people out based on these protected classes. You wouldn't only show a handicapped person the 1st floor units either. That's also discrimination. If they ask to only see the 1st floor, that's fine. But you do not automatically say, let's only go see the 1st floor units. Every single thing you do has to hit every demographic the same. That's the whole point of the fair housing laws. Nobody should feel different in your advertising, your marketing, or the way that they do things. And so singling out families with kids is a huge fair housing violation because familial status is protected. There is There is one exemption to the familial status that I'll talk about in a second. What you got, Jacob?
I just keep going.
Probably best. But folks, don't dwell too much on this, okay? Don't dwell too much on this. It's just, you got to test it this way. So, let me give you a question here. True or false, under federal laws, an owner-occupied duplex allows the owner to rent the other half of her residence to females only. True. Because of the roommate rule. As long as it doesn't violate the Civil Rights Act. What you got, Jacob?
Okay, so 2 things. One, if a broker was involved in this, then
Never.
they can't.
Never.
Okay. Second question was, so say for a situation like renting to a family, are you able to potentially, and I'm not saying that I think this is right, I want to clarify that, but are you able to potentially charge more for, say, a family because it's a higher liability because kids are more destructive?
Now, remember what I just said. Everything should hit everybody equally. If a certain protected class feels different about the way that you're advertising the property when no exemptions are allowed, then you are in violation of fair housing. Folks, let me take this a step further. If we advertise a house as a real estate broker and we say the house is in walking distance to local parks, can every person walk?
No.
No. So it may hit differently. What do you say? Close proximity to parks. 0.2 miles from parks. Things should hit people differently, or should not hit people differently. So you cannot charge based on the fact that you have kids or not. That would be a huge familial status violation. Turning down people who have kids is a huge fair housing violation. You gotta be careful. So real estate brokers and residential landlords are always bound by the Fair Housing Act. The only exemption is selling as a for sale by owner on a federal. Here's a spoiler alert though. The state fair housing does not allow a for sale by owner to discriminate. So North Carolina state says, we don't care who you are. When you sell a house, you cannot discriminate even as a for sale by owner in North Carolina. Federal laws say you can. North Carolina says no. So the exemptions, the roommate rule still applies in North Carolina. That's the same. But the for sale by owner is not an exemption in North Carolina. And let me see if I can find the North Carolina just so you can see this real quick. Actually, let me go back. What is this? Yeah. Where is North Carolina? There you go. So the prohibited is the same as federal, although I told you for sale by owner, not exempt. The roommate rule is still exempt. And then North Carolina actually adds in that a same-sex dormitory can be discriminatory. It is okay to say that no, a male cannot live in a female dormitory, and vice versa. Of course, the federal laws do not state that. However, I would be remiss to think that the federal laws would ever have an issue with that policy because it just makes good sense. Now, understand the differentiation between who you report it to. If you feel like there was a violation of your rights under North Carolina fair housing, that is reported to the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. If we go back to the federal, it is reported to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There you go. HUD. Right there. Now, if you feel like your rights were violated under federal fair housing, you have to report that to the Department of Housing and Urban Development within 1 year of the incident, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development has up to 100 days to determine if they want to go after somebody for the discrimination or it should be dismissed. Now, of course, folks, understand a lot of them are dismissed because sometimes people have baseless claims, and they'll say, well, they didn't rent to me because I was this. No, sir, it was because you were broke and you were a felon. They're allowed to deny you for those reasons. But people sometimes feel a certain kind of way. So I'll probably talk just for about 5 minutes on this and the other topic tomorrow night as we get into the North Carolina to wrap up. And so first 45 minutes to an hour we'll be finishing up material, and then the rest of the time will be